Welcome to the Rubin Museum of Art in New York City. In the series Brainwave, neuroscientists meet with people from other walks of life to better understand the workings of our minds. Here, pastry chef and chocolatier Jacques Torres talks to neuroscientist David Linden about the compass of pleasure.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Rubin Museum of Art. I'm Tim McHenry, the producer here, and this is a museum dedicated to Himalayan art, art from Yunnan, Tibet, China, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and this string of shamanistic belief that ranges right up through to northern Mongolia and South Siberia. So, chocolate and Tibet, not a common combination, unless, of course, you've been rummaging in your recent trail mix for those chocolate-covered Himalayan goji berries. Now, we've talked about chocolate and Tibet and the incompatibility thereof, but pleasure and Tibet, well, it's usually the absence of pleasure that is celebrated in Buddhist teachings. Buddha Shakyamuni, when he left his palace, he tried all sorts of ways by which to seek enlightenment, and most of them entailed denial. There was another prince around that time who sought to do the same. He saw, oh, this prince is getting enlightened. I think I'll have a crack at it. His name was Luipa, and he became known as Luipa the fish gut eater. Appetizing, isn't it? What he did was, you have to understand, get a picture of Luipa. He had this glorious head of hair, which he did not shave. That's monastic. The Mahasiddhas, the tantric mystics of this time, kept their hair and kept growing it and piled it on top of their heads. And he would go around the villages and towns with his mendicant's bowl and ask for handouts. Now, the women of the household were particularly susceptible to Luipa because he was pretty damn good looking. And they took a shine to him and gave them the best offerings of the house. Now, Luipa, therefore, didn't look emaciated and didn't look as if he was suffering. He was doing okay, but he thought he was getting somewhere towards enlightenment. And he did so every day, the same thing, until he was walking along the banks of the Ganges, and he came to one of the inns at the edge of the Ghats. And it was quite close to where the fishermen were dumping their morning's catch onto the wharf. And he knocked on the door of this inn, and he sort of did his usual shtick by handing out, could you spare just some crumbs for a traveling mendicant? And the woman in the house sort of gave him the up and down and said, oh, of course, I've got just the thing for you. Stay here, don't move. Went inside, came back with a pot, which stank pretty rank, by the way, and dipped a ladle into it and poured the slops of God knows what it was that she'd been cooking into his bowl and said, there you go, that'll do. And, of course, as a mendicant, he could not refuse and professed gratitude and went his way down the wharf towards the fishermen. And just when he thought he'd turned the corner, he went, I'm not eating this shit. Poured it out. Now, the householder was no ordinary woman. She was a dakini who had been sent to test him. And she can look around corners to a certain extent. And called out after him, and she said, here, you with the hair on, come back here. And Luipa thought, oh, all right, now I've torn it. And he sheepishly came back, and she said, Luipa, you are not ready for enlightenment, nor will you ever be as long as you have attachments to this world. Your attachment is to pleasure, to taste. Lose it, or else you're never going to get there, kid. And Luipa took this to heart, or I should say to stomach. As he was passing back down the wharf, the fisherman had long since left, And the dogs were fighting over the entrails of the fish. And he thought, if the dogs can do it, I can do it. And he sat down, and for the next 12 years, all he ate were the guts of the fish, the rejects, until he could no longer notice the distinction between what he was eating and what was everything. And sure enough, he reached enlightenment. And you can see a portrait of him along with the other 84 Mahasiddhas in the third floor gallery, which is newly installed, of the murals of the Lukang Temple, the private temple palace of the Dalai Lama. So hope to see you back to view that sometime soon. So, pleasure, the absence of it, and chocolate. What a combination.
This evening, David Linden, Professor of Neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine in Baltimore, is to talk to Jacques Torres, the chocolatier, about how pleasure is processed in the brain. Dr. Linden's book, The Compass of Pleasure, is subtitled How Our Brains Make Fatty Foods, Orgasm, Exercise, Marijuana, Generosity, Vodka, Learning, and Gambling Feel So Good. He is also the author of a neuroscience book for a general audience, The Accidental Mind, How Brain Evolution Has Given Us Love, Memory, Dreams, and God. Jacques Torres is the youngest ever winner of the Meilleur Ouvrier de France, and after 11 years as executive pastry chef at Le Cirque, he founded Jacques Torres Chocolate in Brooklyn. His book is entitled A Year in Chocolate. Please welcome them.
Hello, David.
Hello. Bonjour. You are, in one sense, a master provider of pleasure for many people in New York and around the country and indeed, in some cases, all over the world. And so can you tell us what were some of the formative, pleasurable experiences in your upbringing that you think have molded how you approach this task in your professional life now?
I think experience, and all the chefs look at that, experience will show us what people will like or not. Something that I learn is, don't ask actually the customer if they like it or not. Most of the time they will say they like it. So what I learned in the kitchen is actually to look at the dish coming back. That actually doesn't lie. If the dish is empty, you know that was, people like it. Or they was really hungry. if few of the same dish come back untouched or barely touched, then you know that you don't bring the pleasure that you should. And I think we, as chefs, we always think about what can we do that will bring pleasure, but pleasure to a big range of people. A lot of time, what's difficult to understand is that person like it, that person don't like it. What do we do to actually attract more people? I think I went through chocolates because actually chocolate is one of those products that's commonly loved by so many people. Any gender, any age, any culture. Chocolate is one of the products that most people love. So I think that's why, I mean, I love to work with it, but one of the reasons is commonly loved.
So when you approach decisions about how to cook, whether it is chocolate or pastry or anything else, are you looking to maximize the appeal? In other words, to give the most pleasure to the widest number of people? Or do you have a vision? Are you cooking for you? Are you cooking for the audience?
Actually, I think I'm very fortunate to have an average palate. Some chefs, I work with, a chef at Le Cirque. His name is Sotakun, after Daniel Boulou, Cambodian gentleman. Grew up in Cambodia, came to France, was exposed very young to a lot of different culture, but also high-end food. Develop an unbelievable palate. I think that when a chef is like that, and you have to start somewhere, so you're going to cook basically for yourself, you're going to cook what you love to eat. That doesn't going to work with a big range of people. I think I have a very average palate. And I would like what a lot of people would love. So that's worked a little bit better for me.
Is there ever anything where you think, well, I bet only 5% of my customers, my audience will like this, but I think it is just fantastic. It's something weird that will give tons of pleasure to a few people, so I'm going to do it anyway. Do you ever approach that?
Yes, and that's what you're going to taste today.
Ah.
You're going to taste.
You've been bold.
You're going to taste two chocolates. One that I'm pretty sure everybody's going to love, and say, wow, this is what we know, this is what we can recognize, and we love that. Another chocolates are a little bit more surprising. It's a single origin. I will develop that a little bit more, but when you taste it, it has more than chocolate flavor, even if it's only chocolates. And that's, for some people, is annoying, because it doesn't have just what you know, what you can relate to. So yes, I do that. And that's to spice up a little bit what I do. And just make me happy to surprise people sometimes.
Well, that's good, and perhaps broaden people's horizons as well.
Yes, and again, one of those, something that I discover with food, with chocolate especially, in Europe, we don't have Hershey chocolates. And I'm not... That was not funny. I mean, when I came, I did some research, and I worked for different companies as a R&D person, and we did a tasting, and they give me actually a piece of, and they know my reaction actually, a piece of milk Hershey chocolates, and I don't say that it's not good. What I say is that when I eat it, it was very surprising to me. The flavor was not pleasure. It has that sourness on the back. That's not something that I grew up with. That's not something that I'm used to. And I look at them and I say, what's wrong with that? I mean, is that a joke or what's? And then they explained to me that that's actually very interesting that you react like that, because if you grow up with that, you will love it. So that's to me it's confusing as a chef. Yes. What do you do? I'm in a different country. I try to make a pleasurable product, but you have to understand the clientele. You have to understand what people love, yes, what they grew up with. So it's also cultural. So that's for a chef, I think that's quite complicated. You really have to dig here to understand what people are going to love.
Yes. Well, so I think maybe I can take this point to amplify on some of the biology that underlies this issue. So you spoke very clearly and said, for you grew up in France, you had a particular set of things that you tasted in your youth that you became accustomed to, and then when you eat a Hershey bar, it just seems wrong. And whereas people who grew up with Hershey bars might have a different feeling. So it's worthwhile thinking about the nature-nurture issue in terms of food preferences, not just as applied to chocolate, but applied generally. And when you try to untangle nature-nurture issues in biology, the gold standard of this is called the adopted monozygotic twin study. So monozygotic twins are what in common parlance is called identical twins. So they have exactly, or nearly exactly, the same genetic makeup. And there are a small number, but enough to study, of identical twins that have been raised apart in different environments. And so people really like to study these folks because they've got the same genes, and yet they have different environments. And when you do this, you find some very shocking things. You find that identical twins raised apart, even in very different environments, tend to pick as their love partners people with very similar personalities. And if you try to analyze their sense of humor, which you would think would be a very labile, easily modifiable thing, again, there's a highly statistical heritability. But if you go to look at food preference has very little genetic basis. The variance in food preference is 80% roughly determined by one's experience, heavily biased towards one's early experience. And so I think this is the biology that speaks to your Hershey moment. I think another issue to think about here, and I think this is particularly relevant for chocolate, is that we are, while we as individuals have a lot of variation, obviously even people who've been raised in the same culture, there are some people who really like sweet things and some who don't. People who really enjoy bitter greens, for example, and some who don't. So there's a lot of individual variation, but generally speaking, we humans, we like fatty things, we like salty things, and we like sweet things.
Basically everything that's bad for us.
Well, here's the thing. It's everything that is bad for us in our modern diet, right? Here's the problem. Culture moves very fast. Evolution moves very, very slowly. So our brain circuitry and our bodies are not well adapted to this very particular moment here in 2011, where we all in this room live in a situation where essentially we have unlimited calories available, right? Even the poorest folks in the United States have nearly unlimited calories available. A lot of times it's not very healthy food, but it's unlimited calories. And that's incidentally why actually there's more obesity if you're poor in the US than there is actually if you're wealthy. But you have this mismatch. We have evolved for an ancestral diet that doesn't exist anymore. Our ancestral diet had very little meat. It had very little fat. It had almost nothing sweet. It had very few foods that had a lot of moisture or oil content in them. As a result, most of the things in the ancestral diet took a lot of chewing. It took a lot of effort to eat them. And what it means is that in the ancestral food environment, if you encounter something that's sweet, like wild honey, for example, it's very much to your evolutionary advantage to snarf it all down. Because tomorrow, there might not be any food at all. And the day after that, there might not be any food at all. And likewise, if you have meat or another food with a high fat content, it's to your advantage to snarf it down because you might have a week of fasting afterwards, and if you were able to lay on a little body fat, that might actually keep you alive. Now, of course, those hardwired predispositions don't serve us very well.
That was the time to open a chocolate shop.
Yes.
Late.
Well, I think when you speak of the difference between a Hershey bar and your own very high-quality chocolates made with a high fraction of cacao solids, other people who put a lot of effort into making a very high-quality product, these are actually nutritionally quite different, aren't they?
Yes. We try to actually make a chocolate that will bring you more flavor, less sugar, and like wine, different origin will define different flavor profile. Mm-hmm. And then into that you can roast the chocolate a little bit more, a little bit less. You can aerate during the conching. I mean, it's a lot of techniques that are going to give you, with two similar beans, completely two different chocolates.
So you use the phrase conching. Maybe, I think for most of the audience, they probably don't know what that is. Could you elaborate?
Chocolates come from a cacao pod. That pod going to be harvested. It's a little bit like a papaya, a big papaya. Cut in half. Inside we're going to find a white pulp and some seeds, about 40 seeds in a pod. Those seeds are the cacao beans. But what is pretty unknown is that those cacao beans need to be fermented before we make the chocolates. So those cacao beans and the pulp going to be put certainly usually in wood boxes. Mm-hmm. And let ferment for, depending on the time, on the temperature and the humidity. When the core reaches a certain temperature, they are taken out and put into mat to dry. The drying can take a few days. When they are dried, put into big burlap bag, 70 kilos, so almost 150 pounds, and sent to wherever going to process those beans. So I receive some of those beans. I will of course go through about 100 of them, cut them, look at if they are well fermented, no under, no over, infestation of any bugs, mold, any kind of plant disease. If they are what we want, I will order them and make chocolate from them. So when we make chocolates, we're going to roast those cacao beans. That's the first step. The roasting is very important. The roasting going to define with the, of course, with the fermentation, going to define the characteristic of your chocolates. I love to have a nutty chocolate when it's a time just before they burn where they get a very nutty flavor. That's what you will taste today. I stop the roasting and put them into a machine that's going to stop and cool them right away. Then we put them into a winnower. Winnower going to remove the shell from the inside. The inside now it's called the nibs. So the nibs is the most is the purest form of chocolates. It has almost nothing to do with, as flavor-wise, with what you're going to taste as chocolates, but it's very surprising. Then we take those nibs. It's a different process, but basically the most common process will be to grind those nibs into a paste called cacao paste. Look like chocolate, but again, it's almost unedible because it's no sweet at all. It's very, very strong. Then we will add a certain percentage of sugar, usually higher quality cacao beans, less sugar you're going to put. So I love the 70%, 30% sugar. Add the sugar, put them into a refiner. A refiner are succession of roll that going to crunch that paste to a 20 micron particle size. So 20 micron is when you cannot feel any grain on your palate when you rub your tongue on your palate. Everything is so smooth. Then,
if I could just interrupt for a second, to give you an idea of what 20 microns is, a typical hair on your head is about 80 microns in diameter, so it's about 1/4 of the diameter of that. Sorry, please continue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So then from there, we put that in a conch. That's the piece of equipment that I was talking about. We conch our chocolate for 72 hours, which is a very long conching time, and we extract all the acidity. That process is going to allow all the unpleasant flavor to basically evaporate from that chocolate, and also to remove all the moisture that will be left into those cacao beans and sugar. And we will end up with pretty much the chocolate that we're going to eat. We usually add a little bit of cocoa butter, that's for the mouthfeel, and a little bit of lecithin, that's going to bond any molecule of water left with the molecule of fat. And then maybe vanilla, but that will be it. I don't put vanilla on the chocolate that I bring today. And that's the chocolates. So longer the conching is, usually higher the quality of the chocolate if you have very good beans to start with. So it's a long process. And I taste actually in Mexico. I went to Oaxaca and spent some time in a family to learn how to use spices. I love, that was so interesting to me. We work with ancho chili and chipotle chili, but they do chocolate by hand and just grind chocolate for a couple hours and mix the sugar and keep grinding them. So here you taste basically the unconched chocolates, and then you can taste a piece of chocolate and really see the difference and see what the conching can bring to chocolates.
All right. So we have all this wonderful crafting effort going in to make this pleasurable thing, and we go to eat it, and let's talk a little bit about what happens in your brain then. And so if I can go on a little bit, what I'd like to say is that we now know that there are a set of interconnected regions in the brain, and they're on the midline of the brain, and they're towards the front, and so it's called the medial forebrain pleasure circuit. And these brain regions have names like the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, and they're critically dependent upon signaling using the neurotransmitter called dopamine. And it turns out that this pleasure circuit is strongly activated when someone takes a bite of your delicious chocolate and lets it dissolve on their tongue and is feeling that mouthfeel and tasting all those wonderful things that you've brought to the fore. But crucially, this pleasure circuit is a general pleasure circuit. So it is also engaged by sex. When you have an orgasm, you're activating this pleasure circuit.
With the chocolates? We call that...
Well, you know, there is a long-standing link between this.
We call that enhancement, you know.
Well, you know, they've done a lot of things with people in brain scanners, right? So they've had people eat chocolate in a brain scanner. Now, it's actually very hard to actually chew a piece of chocolate because it makes your head jiggle and the brain scanner can't function. So they actually have to shoot like a little chocolate milkshake into the mouth, right? Because that's just because of the way the brain scanner works. And they have actually had people with their heads in the brain scanner while they're having an orgasm. Now, I mean, I just want to, you know, let's think about this.
That
right?
doesn't move into the scanner, you know?
Right? But to date, as far as I know, nobody has ever actually done the two simultaneously to see if there would be a super additivity. So let's think about this experiment, which, by the way, these experiments are done mostly in Holland, right, where you can get approval for this sort of thing. So they've done this with both men and women. The head's in the brain scanner, the rest of the body is sticking out. And the brain scanner, if you've ever seen pictures of these things, are like a big metal donut, and it clangs. And they use a kind of brain imaging called positron emission tomography. So you got to have an IV line in your arm, right? So you're lying there, your nether regions are sticking out, there's an IV line in your arm, your head's in this big clanging metal donut, and the love of your life is there, you know, manually stimulating you, trying to bring you to orgasm.
Only the Dutch, you know.
Now, I don't know if it's possible for there to be a less sexy environment than that. Oh, and there's another thing, and that is, in order to know, particularly for the women, to know whether it's a real orgasm and not a faked one, there is actually a pressure transducing probe in these experiments that's inserted into the anus. Because it turns out that this is one way to actually tell. Everyone has rectal contractions, both men and women, during a genuine orgasm. But they did a very clever experiment. They asked women to do their best faking of an orgasm, and then no rectal contractions. So that's there too. You've got the rectal thing, you've got the Hopkins probe, the IV line, the head, and the... Okay, so what happens in the brain? What's the result of the experiment?
They don't talk about that in Sex and the City, if you remember.
Well, the result of the experiment is that there are a number of brain regions that are activated, but crucially, this medial forebrain pleasure circuit, which is also being activated by the chocolate, is also activated at the moment of orgasm, and it is activated in both men and women, although in women for a slightly longer duration, as women's orgasms, even single orgasms, tend to be of a slightly longer duration. What's also interesting, and which actually jibes well with one's personal experience, it's not just that there are areas of the brain that are activated during orgasm, there are other areas that are being deactivated. So the areas of your brain involved in, say, reasoning, decision-making, social cognition. This is not the moment where you want to be making your business plan or doing your taxes.
That's what men doesn't have enough blood. That's what I heard, you know.
So we have this pleasure circuit in our brain. It's activated by things like feeding and drinking and sex. And of course, that all makes sense, right? Because if you want to propagate your genes into the next generation, you want those behaviors to be pleasurable and rewarding so that people will do them again. But it turns out that there are ways of short-circuiting this reward system as well. So if you take a poppy plant and you extract morphine from that poppy plant and you convert it into heroin and you inject it in your arm, well, you'll activate that same pleasure circuit. But it turns out that in our primate lineage, so we and monkeys like us, this pleasure circuit is very heavily interconnected with brain regions having to do with emotion, memory, self-control, social cognition, and a number of other things. And the connections between those higher brain regions and the pleasure circuit can be very strongly modified by experience, and they can be modified in ways that can last your entire life. So essentially, there's every part of your brain can learn, right? When we think about nature versus nurture, nurture has the ability to impact nearly every location in your brain and even locations in your spinal cord, including this pleasure circuit. Now, so what does that mean for our human existence? It means that while a rat can be, have its pleasure circuit activated by eating or sex, and we can as well, only a human can have their pleasure circuit activated by fasting or by abstaining from sex. And actually, this is a very interesting Buddhist connection to the story we heard from Tim at the outset. So what I would say, actually, if you would take these Buddhist ascetics or ascetics in any tradition, what you would find is that as they have internalized this cultural idea that there can be enlightenment through the denial of pleasure, what you would find is actually their pleasure circuit is being activated anyway by that denial. And it turns out that giving to charity activates the pleasure circuit. Giving to charity even anonymously activates the pleasure circuit. Learning does. Exercise does. It's not just our vices, it's also our virtues. And when we live in a complicated culture, and when we have the ability to modify these interconnections between our pleasure circuit and the higher parts of our brain, what it means is that utterly arbitrary experiences can now bring us pleasure. Mere ideas, mere ideologies can bring us pleasure. And of course, everything that we have experienced in our lives, particularly those things that we experienced early, has molded that.
What's about music? What's about visual? From a painting to a sculpture to a packaging.
Yes.
I think that those, to us, it's important to present something that looks beautiful,
yes,
that kind of prepare for the pleasure. I mean, people love to see something beautiful, then we'll have pleasure by eating it. But do you define that as pleasure to look at something beautiful?
Well, I think from a biological basis, I define pleasure as something that you are motivated to repeat, something that when it happens, you develop positive associations with the other things that are going around, both your internal state and in the external world, and in your brain, something that will activate this dopaminergic circuit. Now, it turns out that there have been experiments in which people are listening to music, and not only are they reporting at the end what they found pleasurable, but they have a little dial where they are indicating their relative pleasure during certain passages. And at those same moments, they're in a brain scanner, and they are imaging the pleasure circuit. And it turns out that the scientific evidence here is a little bit weedy. It's early days, but there are at least some studies that have indicated that people's highest moments of pleasure during a certain musical performance, for example, do indeed correlate with the highest activation of these dopamine neurons in the pleasure circuit. And actually, this comes over very well to the idea of food. So if you put people in a brain scanner, and they're hungry, and you show them pictures or you give them smells of the foods, and you ask them to rate which foods they like or dislike, it turns out that, not surprisingly, you see the highest activation of the pleasure circuit from the foods they report they like the most, and the least from the foods that they report the least. Similarly, if you're really hungry before a meal, right, everything tastes really good. And sure enough, if you take people who are really hungry and then let them have some food while they're in the brain scanner, their degree of pleasure circuit activation is greater than someone who had eaten more recently. And not only that, but you know how the first few bites taste extra delicious, particularly when you've been hungry? Oh, I can't wait. And then maybe you're getting some anticipation. You can smell it from the kitchen. You can see the other people in the restaurant, and you're salivating, and you're looking forward to it. You're already ramping up the activity of your pleasure circuit before it even happens. And then when it comes, those first few bites are great. And the last bite might be good, but it wasn't as good as the first bites. Sure enough, in the brain scanner, those first bites are producing much more activation of this circuit than the last bites were. So it turns out that there is actually an excellent correlation in most cases between this measurement and what we experience subjectively in this realm.
Interesting. That's why we invent foreplay, I think. Even for food.
Why we invent foreplay, both for food and for sex. And actually, another kind of foreplay is something that we see in gambling. Right? So gambling is something that gives a lot of folks pleasure, and people can become addicted to gambling in the same way that they become addicted to drugs or sex or food, all of which can become addictions. And so, well, how can this be? Well, one model would say, all right, so you have someone and they go to the casino and they put a bet down on a particular number on the roulette wheel, and the roulette wheel spins, and they do that a few times, and if they're lucky enough to have an early win experience, and the first few times they bet, they get rewarded, and they go, oh, that's good, I'm feeling pleasure, and so that's making them more likely to go back and do it again, and those people are more likely to become problem gamblers. Well, actually, it turns out that there are two things that are wrong about that. First of all, we're not just rewarded in our brains. We don't just get pleasure circuit activation when we win. Just like being in the restaurant and waiting for the food and getting some of the stimuli and smelling the smells and anticipating it is pleasurable in itself. When that roulette wheel is spinning, you actually see a slow ramping up of pleasure circuit activation. Now, obviously, when this is done in a brain scanner, and this has been done actually with both monkeys and humans, you're not actually having a physical roulette wheel, right? It's a digital roulette wheel on a screen above your face in the metal donut. And not that pleasant. But nonetheless, people are playing for real money, and they get really genuinely activated. And what you see is that literally, while the roulette wheel is spinning, while the virtual roulette wheel is spinning, they're getting activated. We humans seem to be hardwired to take pleasure from probabilistic situations. We actually enjoy situations that are uncertain. We are hardwired to take a certain amount of risk. And again, if one wants to speculate evolutionarily, you can imagine that that's good. If you're an entirely timid hunter-gatherer, you're probably not going to be very successful. If you are a too risky hunter-gatherer, you're probably not going to be successful either. There's a place in the middle where you are optimizing your chance of passing your genes on. The other thing actually has to speak to addiction. And this holds for addiction to food or to gambling or to drugs. And so the cultural idea we have is, well, addicts get more pleasure from the thing that they become addicted to than we do, right? If you develop a gambling addiction, it's because when you place that bet and you win, it feels great. And for someone else, it might only feel pretty good. And therefore, they're more likely to repeat it. Yeah.
But not everybody going to have the same level of addictive personality.
Absolutely, right. I'm sure you see this, you probably have people who come to your store every day and others who come more moderately, right?
That's why, how do I make everyone addictive? That's my question. What do I put in my chocolates?
Well, you might want to do some genetic testing. It turns out that, so there's no single gene for addiction. And it turns out that of course, genetics isn't the entire explanation for addiction at all. It turns out that the susceptibility to addiction, about 40% of that variance can be explained by one's genes, and the remainder by non-genetic biological factors, and then mostly by one's experience, including stress, which has a very important role. But it turns out that there is one genetic variant we know of, and it's a gene for something called the D2 dopamine receptor. And the dopamine receptor is merely a protein that's expressed on the surface of nerve cells in the pleasure circuit, and which senses the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine that's activated by all these pleasurable things like chocolate and sex and heroin and so on. And you might think, oh, well, I understand then, you're going to tell me that these addicts have a super amped up pleasure circuit and they love it so much that they can't help become addicted. It actually turns out to be just the opposite. It turns out that if you carry a genetic variant that makes it so that your pleasure circuit is damped down, is blunted, that it responds less to the dopamine that's released, then, through some reason we don't entirely understand, you are going to seek a set point of pleasure that is constant. So for someone who has a normally functioning pleasure circuit, maybe they can eat your delicious chocolate moderately and be happy. And for someone who has this allele, this variant of the dopamine D2 receptor, in order to get the same amount of pleasure that the other person did, they've got to eat it every day and have 10 pieces. They've got to not just gamble occasionally, but gamble compulsively until they lose all their money. They have to not just drink socially, but drink to the level of oblivion every night.
And now, someone addicted to, or with an addictive personality, will be addictive to everything, or to some product, to alcohol, not to gambling, or to gambling, not to chocolates, or do they have a personality, an addictive personality to everything?
Well, so that's a great question, and the answer is in between. So it turns out that there are some folks who will develop an addiction only to one particular stimulus. And keep in mind, you can become addicted to virtuous things, not just to vices. So you can become addicted to exercise. I'm sure there's some of you here in this audience that look pretty buff. You're probably addicted to exercise. And when you are addicted, there has been a transformation from liking to wanting, right? When you start out with something pleasurable, you're liking it. It is bringing you lots of pleasure. The trajectory of addiction is that there are a set of biochemical and electrical and morphological changes in the pleasure circuit that make it such that actually you're getting much less pleasure than you used to. For things like drugs, like heroin, you need a much larger dose than you did before to get the same kind of high. And most importantly, what sex addicts or drug addicts or food addicts report is that at this point, they don't do this because they're deriving great pleasure anymore. They need to do that just to feel normal, just to function, just to get up in the morning, just to go to work, just to get through their day, just to feel okay. And That same trajectory you see in all these addictions. Now, in terms of individuals, yes, there are some individuals who will only become addicted to one thing or another. But there is very significant co-occurrence of addiction. So if you go to Las Vegas and you take the people who are compulsively pulling that slot machine and you ask them, are you hooked on cigarettes?
That's why they smoke and drink and play.
Right. There's tremendous, what doctors call comorbidity, right? So if you carry this allele of the dopamine receptor, you carry an increased risk for a large number of addictions, not just for one. And there are folks who harbor a number of these things in parallel.
What's about the pleasure given by giving? Is that come from an animal instinct that we want to give? I mean, giving food. Giving food makes people happy. Yes. Invite a friend to a restaurant and see me happy, make us happy. So we basically give something that gives pleasure and make the person happy.
Right, and it turns out, well, that's very true, and it's very true cross-culturally, and it's actually true cross-species. And there are, I think, several things to say about that. So when you give someone food or some other nice thing, if you give money to charity, for example, there are several things that will activate your pleasure circuit. Part of it is the social context. So it turns out that positive social regard from our peers is something that activates the pleasure circuit, not surprisingly. Now, there was a fellow named Harbaugh at the University of Oregon who said, I want to do a study that tries to pull apart the high social regard that I get from giving to charity, the social regard that I get from some more intrinsic internal reward. So he set up a situation, and this all has to do with anonymous choices that people are making with real money they've been given, but through a computer screen while they're in a brain scanner, and asking, even when they're giving to charity anonymously, will you still see activation of the pleasure circuit? Is there true altruism? In other words, even when nobody knows whether you did it or didn't, regard from your peers isn't an issue. And it turns out that not everyone, but a very large fraction of people get activation of the pleasure circuit from anonymous charitable giving. Another thing that I think is relevant here, and in a way this harkens back to the ancestral diet, and that is we are also hardwired for ancestral social organization, right? Right now, if you live in New York City, right, the people who are around you, most of them don't share your genes. We're a highly diverse society in terms of our genetic background and our social background, but we're evolved to live in groups of people who share very many of our genes. And so one can certainly speculate that sharing food or sharing other resources is something that makes a lot of evolutionary sense, particularly when those people around you are most related. And this is what I think explains what I call the European gradient of socialism, right? In Northern Europe, in Finland, had 5,000 founders for all the modern Finns. So Finns share their DNA to a tremendous degree for a modern society. They have a very socialist society. They have a very high tax rate, and people are very willing to share their resources. You go down to Southern Europe, there's a lot more mixing that's happened through history. People share their genes with their neighbors to a much lesser degree, and you have a gradient of reduced socialism, of reduced sharing as you move south. Would this be a good time to bestow the chocolates upon the audience? Is this the first chocolate?
Okay, so the first chocolate is the thicker one, the one who has a little bit different shape, yes. So what I like to do is usually take the chocolates, smell it. So I love to first smell that chocolate and try to define the smell usually can help you to know the percentage of sugar, and if you do that a lot, the smell will help you to tell if it's a bittersweet or a semi-sweet. And And if you do that a little bit more, you can go and say it's a 60, 70, 80% cocoa content according to the smell of the chocolates. When you eat the chocolates, I love to put the chocolate in my mouth, chew it 2 or 3 times, 3, 4 times, and let it melt. Now you have all the flavor exploding, covering your taste bud, come back to your nose. That's where you can actually feel what's into that chocolate, what the chocolate is. Is it just a plain flavor of chocolate and stop pretty much here? Do you have any citrus? Do you have any berry? Do you have anything else in it? Then you will eat it. When the chocolate melts, you're going to see if it's anything left in your mouth, if the chocolate is pasty, if it's enough fat into that chocolate to actually melt completely and disappear. Now, the after flavor are important. If the chocolate contains what we call natural flavor, essential oil or natural flavor, if you see that on a package, don't buy it. That means I don't make it. Don't buy it. If you see that on a package, that means essential oil or natural flavor a lot of time going to stick with you. So you eat a piece of chocolate and that's going to linger because those flavors stay into your taste buds. Then it's not as pleasant. You eat another piece of chocolate and everything gets mixed together. Another thing is when you eat non-real chocolates is a chocolate where the cocoa butter was extracted and some other fat was put instead of it. Cocoa butter will melt at your body temperature. That means that when you eat it, nothing going to coat your taste buds and feel waxy. Some of the fat used on non-real chocolates going to give you that waxy flavor in your mouth. And imagine what you can do with a chocolate that melts at your body temperature. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you have second piece of chocolate, the one a little bit longer, it's a little bit thinner. This piece of chocolate, please smell it before you eat it. Here you're going to, the smell is completely different. This one is 70%. We actually make it here in our manufacture. Cacao beans come from Dominican Republic, single origin. So here you're going to smell a lot more citrus, a lot more berry. It's a lot more whimsical than the first chocolates. 3 are Trinitario. It's not a Criollo, it's a Trinitario tree. The flavor are completely different. This chocolate is not liked by everyone. I find it more interesting, but interestingly, it's like wine. More people would love, in a tasting, more people would love a table wine, a wine that more people are exposed to, than a high-end wine. Not everybody will love a high-end wine. It's not something that, it's something pretty surprising, but it's true. Chocolate will work the same. Not everyone will love that type of chocolate. So to come back what we are saying earlier, this is a product that I do that not everybody going to love. Mm-hmm. But I think that I love to expose people to that. I love to talk about it. I love to drive some tasting with that.
It's delicious. Wonderful.
So tasting plain chocolates, that's pretty much what usually the purist will do to try to define origin and percentage and all those things.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Let's conduct one last experiment, shall we? It's our tradition here at this museum dedicated to Himalayan culture that we, of course, conclude such sessions with a ceremony that would happen in Tibet. And this is the awarding of a katak. And Cindy, if I could have just one of those for now. Thank you. This is a silk scarf that's awarded to distinguished visitors to a home. And it's interwoven with auspicious symbols to protect the bearer on their journey, whether it be back to Baltimore or whether it be back to Brooklyn.
You need it too.
Well, and why this should give you pleasure is not only do we acknowledge your mastery in your fields, but it's a gift. And it's meant to remain a gift. So these gentlemen don't really, in principle, get to keep it. It's to be awarded to the next distinguished visitor to their home, and so on, so that this cycle of giving, which we've talked about, and this continuation of the generosity of pleasure is continued. And so let's start it here, and let's continue it. Chef Torres, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for encompassing everything in your book.
Thank you so much for coming to the Rubin Museum of Art, everyone. Good night.
Merci beaucoup.